Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. The topic of today's discussion is to turn our attention to the interaction of buyers and sellers in what is called market transactions. And market transactions are the buying and selling of goods or resources or assets or something of that particular nature. So the way we go through, where's my guy? So the way we go through is to build separate models of the buyer's behavior, that's called demand, separate models of the seller's behavior, that's called supply, and then eventually look at the interaction of the two groups and see what implications follow from that assumption. So I talked to you previously about the fact that scarcity implies, number one, people have to make choices, right? If you have scarcity, you don't have enough, you have to choose which things you're going to do. Secondly, we define carefully economic cost, and we defined it as being opportunity cost or economic cost. And then finally, we noted that because of scarcity, we are automatically in a state of competition with each other. And we talked about three general categories of competition: violence, primitive, a form of competition, exists in nature, exists in societies today. Political, social political is where you're competing based on some set of rules, like the rules of a game or things of that nature. And then finally, economic competition. And when we study market activity, that's what we're focused on, is economic competition. That's the form of competition where you produce value for others, like on your job, and you use that value, and it's an exchange system. Remember the circular flow model. So you receive dollars in exchange for the work that you do, or the use of your land, or the use of your building. Remember, resources includes all three of those categories. Then you use the dollars to bid for the things you would like to acquire. We use the dollars to go out in the marketplace and bid for the things we would like to have. Notice some implications of that. In a market system, you have an incentive to produce the most value you possibly can for the rest of society, because the more value you produce, the more dollars you receive. Everybody with me? You really have an incentive to figure out what can I do well for other members of society, and then focus on that, as you're all doing right now, choosing majors and making those kinds of decisions. And then the second implication is that the allocation of the goods, when they're allocated by who bids the most for them, the goods end up going to those people who value them the most. So goods are allocated according to price, a price, and only those people who have a value above or equal to price will end up buying the good. And so whatever number of goods there are, they go to those people who value them the most. The simple example of that is like an auction, right? And you know what the auction system is, right? American auction. You're bidding against, and then you know you're in competition with the other buyers. And the guy who bids the most is the person who ends up getting the good. And so that is also true in market activity, in the sense that if the leather jacket has a price tag of $500 at Nordstrom's, only people willing and able to spend the $500 will get the jacket, right? Leaving aside theft and other forms of competition. Good. So this circular flow model is a model of the exchange system. It's called a circular flow diagram because we're looking at actual activities that take place in a time period. And it's called an exchange economy because we're characterizing this process of trade, this process of exchange, and so forth. Have I gone through this before? I did? Okay, good. So briefly, just to renew your understanding of it, the two economic agents in the system are households and business firms. Households mean you by yourself, or you and your family, or you and whoever you're associated with. And you have two sets of decisions. You have three sets of decisions to make. One, where will I sell or rent my resources? Meaning, what job will I take in the economy? Two, what combination of goods will I buy? What combination of goods will I choose to buy with the income that I'm in fact earning? And finally, how will I choose to use money over time? Will I borrow from credit markets to be able to buy today, or will I invest in financial assets such as stocks, bonds, pension funds, etc., so as to have a flow of dollars in the future? So those are the three sets of decisions that households make. Business firms think about as groups of people, teams of people working together to produce the goods and services taking place. And most goods are produced by firms that are a team of people specializing with their particular ability. Somebody in marketing, somebody in accounting, somebody in finance, and those kinds of areas. The three decisions they have to make are: what combination of resources will I use? What characteristics will I put into my product? And finally, will I lend money in the credit markets, or will I borrow money from the credit markets? And we talked about that process before. The assumptions we make are households are trying to maximize satisfaction, and the economist term for that is utility. In making all those decisions, you're trying to maximize long-run satisfaction from your set of decisions. We assume that firms are trying to maximize profit. And profit is defined as the total revenue flow coming in minus the total economic cost of the resources. So economic profit is total revenue minus total economic cost, which, remember, is opportunity cost of those particular kinds of resources. So markets are made up of these three general categories: factor markets or resource markets, product markets, and credit markets. Finally, as we talked about before, money performs a very significant role because it becomes the intermediary good. It becomes the good that I receive for producing or renting out my resources. I receive that flow, and it's the flow that I use to invest or to buy the goods and services. So the amount of money in the system is critical. The amount of money in the system is critical for the system to operate. When the internet first became a growing area of potential purchases, as the internet began to expand and you began to have more and more opportunities to buy things on the internet, people were very reticent to do that because initially you had to give your credit card information to them. And it's the internet, right? And I don't know who's on the other side, and I don't want to give some guy my credit card, right? And you know, the security code and everything else, including my name and address, etc. So initially, exchange was stymied because of people's concern and worry about that. What arose was a system called PayPal, which you're all familiar with, and that separated out the credit information from what the seller was going to receive. You would charge it to PayPal. They would send the money from your account to the merchant at the appropriate time. But the merchant didn't get all your credit card information and that kind of stuff. So it really did stimulate exchanges taking place. The newest form of money, as you probably know, is Bitcoins and other similar products. And Bitcoins were created using what's called a blockchain of information. And you earn Bitcoins by solving more and more complex mathematical problems. And the guy who created it had in mind a particular total amount of Bitcoins that would probably be the maximum. And then he has a whole series of challenging mathematical problems to solve. A lot of young guys, and guys when I use guys, I mean men and women. Everybody with me? When I say guys, I'm just talking about men, I'm talking about men and women. But a lot of smart young people got computers that were really fast, and then they would go out and what's called mine the Bitcoins, meaning they'd set their computers up to solve these complex mathematical problems, and then they earn Bitcoins in exchange for that. That blockchain mechanism is extremely powerful because it is a database that records every transaction. So every transaction goes into this gigantic database and is recorded as an exchange between you and someone else. Everybody with me? So it's certified. All the transactions then are certified in the blockchain, and you can go in and see, okay, this guy's honest because, you know, I can see him on there and I know what in fact took place. That has expanded now to many of the banks now are using blockchain systems for their transactions between banks. And again, the reason is that it's a very safe transaction because it is in this, it's not Bitcoin, but it's in the same kind of a system. And many of the investment banks and financial intermediaries are also now using that to record their transactions. So when you have scarcity, it also implies that the society has to adopt some mechanism to solve these three generalized questions. First of all, what goods will get produced in society? What goods will be produced in society? And as I said, the goal is to produce that mixture of goods which would maximize the satisfaction of the members of society, or maximize utility in the members of society. You'd want to use the resources to produce the most value possible amongst all the members of society. The Soviet Union, which was a totalitarian state, had a central committee that decided all of the things that would be produced. It wasn't a democracy, it was a totalitarian system. And they decided where all the resources would go. So they decided we want more bombers and submarines and tanks and rifles and Olympic athletes because they wanted to compete in the Olympics in that way. And then they produced very few consumer goods, very few, refrigerators and stoves and all those kinds of things. So eventually, one of the reasons that the Soviet Union fell apart was because they were not responding to what would maximize society's value, but instead they were maximizing their own utility function, which was to be in power and stay in power and things like that. In France, a lot of goods are exchanged through the market system, but many of the rules restrict the amount of exchange in order to benefit particular groups. And so there's more social political competition in France than in the United States. But most goods are produced according to market demand, meaning the votes of buyers with their dollars or their French francs, but in a somewhat more limited manner. In the economic system, our system is mostly market system, although we have constraints too. We have subsidies and we have taxes, other kinds of things. But basically, our system produces in response to dollar votes of the buyers, and that's what all these committee meetings are all about, all over the world right now. What do people want in the product? And is that something I can produce at a cost less than they value it? And if so, there's a potential for profit in that particular manner. Secondly, how to produce. What combination of resources to use? Well, we noted in the circular flow that production decisions are made by firms, and they're attempting to maximize profit, and so they're trying to find the most efficient combination of inputs in order to have a lower cost of production, in order to have potentially a larger profit. So the profit motive drives a lot of what takes place in these decisions, because if I can do it better, meaning more efficiently, then in fact there's a higher potential for earning profit. Finally, for whom to produce, meaning how will you distribute the goods that are produced amongst the members of society? And as we said, in the market system, it's allocated by dollar votes. Whoever is willing and able to pay the most for it ends up with the goods in that particular one. So the study of markets, as we said, is the interaction of these two groups, buyers and sellers. And some markets are very local, and some markets are international. What is your name?
Brandon.
Brandon. Suppose you're running a Domino's Pizza, at the corner of Nordhoff and Reseda. So that's your store. And you're trying to estimate where are the buyers who'd be likely to buy from my store. How far out would you estimate is your geographic market?
5 to 10 mile radius.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, because people from East LA are not going to drive all the way over to your store, right? And one of the reasons why it's 5 to 10 miles and not more than that is the cost of transportation relative to the value of the product. The cost of transportation, either you're incurring by delivering or they're incurring by coming into the store. Good. What would you guess is the relevant market for Honda Motor Corporations of Japan? The relevant market. Where would the buyers come from? All over the world. And the reason is the same thing. You can ship a car on contract anywhere in the world for about $250. And the value of the car is like $30,000. So because the ratio, and I think I put this on the slide now, because the ratio is small, the cost of transportation is very small relative to the value of the product, that expands the size of the geographic market in that particular way. So we focus on buyers and sellers separately, as we said. And in building the model of buyer's behavior to start with, we employ this assumption of what's called ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus is Latin for all other things held constant. Ceteris paribus, all other things held constant. What it means is that when I talk about the effect on demand of an increase in income for what we'll call a normal good, when I look at that relationship, I'm assuming nothing else is changing simultaneously. Everybody with me? I'm going to identify each thing separately, and so as I do that, I'm assuming nothing else is simultaneously changing, because if it is, then it screws up the analysis. If you want to be called a science, you have to have some Latin terms to throw around to impress people, right? You have to be able to say, well, that's true, ceteris paribus, and people, oh, yeah, ceteris paribus. Right? So that's the reason for it. So when you go to buy something, we have this concept of what's called marginal value. Marginal value. And it exists within you, and it depends on your wealth and your liking of various goods. But we define it as the most you would be willing to pay to acquire one more unit of a good. Notice the use of the word marginal. Marginal always means additional. So I'm interested in what's the most you would pay for the first tennis racket, for a second tennis racket, for a third tennis racket. What's the most you'd pay for the first Heineken's beer, the second Heineken's beer, the third Heineken's beer? The most you would pay is also called the reservation price, meaning it's the price at which I would just be willing to make the purchase. Any price above that, I would not make the purchase. Any price at that level or below, I'd be willing to make the trade because the item is worth that particular amount to me. If you see a pizza that has a price tag of $10, if you're going to buy it, what has to be true about how much you value having it? The price tag says $10. That means you're going to have to give up $10 to get the pizza, right? Well, if you're going to buy it, what has to be true from your personal value?
It has to be more than the value of the pizza.
Or equal to. Very good. Yeah, you have to be willing to pay 11 or at a minimum 10 in order to make the purchase. Good. So marginal value compared to price is the key to what people are willing to buy at alternative prices. And marginal value is the most you're willing to pay. If we were to graph marginal value as a height above additional units of a good, we would note, according to the assumptions of economics, that marginal value tends to decline, or marginal value does decline as you have more of any particular good. Think about having 1 gallon of water to consume in a 1-week time period. What would you use it for? You only have 1 gallon, what would you use it for?
Drinking.
Drinking, in order to do what?
Stay alive.
Stay alive. Good. Is that very valuable to you? Yeah. So remember, marginal value is the most you'd be willing to pay. I mean, you don't want to pay that much. much. But if you had to, I suspect you'd be willing to pay all of your wealth and, in fact, even pledge future income if you had to get that gallon of water, because without it, you're dead, right? Good. So it's very, very valuable. First unit's very valuable. What about, how would you use a second gallon of water? What's another highly valued use of water? Good, personal hygiene, right? Very, very valuable. Not as valuable as staying alive, but very valuable. Good. And if you've ever gone camping where you had to take in bottled water, then you really know that, because you just take a bottle and you pour it on, just wipe yourself off, right? I mean, that's because it's very scarce in that case. Good. What's a third highly valued use of water? Excellent. Preparation of food, because number one, you can cook it down so that it becomes edible, and number two, it leaches out the minerals and the other stuff like that. Good. So as you can see, as you acquire more units, as you consider having more units, more gallons of water in a week, the marginal value is declining. The marginal value is going down. The next might be taking a little longer shower, right? And there's a very valuable use of water that we all use a lot of, and that is waste disposal in your homes. A lot of water used for that, very valuable activity. And then there's, maybe growing some vegetables with water, and then maybe there's planting a lawn or decorative plants, and then planting a lawn, and then filling a swimming pool, and then hosing down the driveway. And so as you think of additional units, clearly the marginal value is declining. The marginal value is going down. Good. So marginal value is what you're willing to pay. It declines as you have more units of the good. We draw it often as a line graph, simply to make it easy to look at, simply to make it easy to draw the analysis. And the only characteristic is that it's downward sloping. That's the only part of this that is important in understanding what we're drawing. It does not mean marginal value declines in a linear manner. You all with me? It doesn't mean the next unit is always this much less valuable than the previous unit. When we actually do this in mathematics, we use a quadratic, which is more of a curve, because that's closer to what usually is the case. But for purposes of demonstration, we just draw it in this way. So the data set is the height of the function. The data set is the height of the function. That is measuring the most you're willing and able to give up to acquire that additional unit. Having said that, what is the marginal value of the first unit?
$10.
Good, $10. Of the 8th unit? $3. Of the 10th unit? $1. Good. Marginal value function is a whole set of data. It's a whole set of data. It's the value of each additional unit over some range of possible units. Yeah?
So if once you acquire 10, each additional unit's $1, or is it saying you can have 10 for $1 a piece?
No, it says if you have 9 units, right,
Yeah.
and you're considering buying a 10th unit, that 10th unit is only worth $1 to you, right? Good. So that's what all those things mean, right? Now, how much are you willing to buy? Because that's what we're really trying to solve. Well, looking at that same data set, and you already answered the question, or somebody did. If the pizza costs $10, your marginal value has to be greater than or equal to $10. Otherwise, you wouldn't make the purchase, right? So looking back and comparing marginal value with price, we derive what's called the demand for the good. The demand for the good. And demand is a schedule of the number of units or quantity that you are willing and able to buy at each alternative price. Demand is a schedule of the different quantities you'd be willing to buy at different possible prices. And it is derived from the marginal value function. Here's my marginal value curve. $10 for the first, $9 for the second, $8 for the third. If the price that's announced on the item is $8, what quantity would you be willing to buy? Well, do it one step at a time. Would you buy the first unit? Would you buy the first unit? What's it worth? 10? No, first unit. What do you have to pay? 8, so you'd make the purchase. Second unit, value's 9, price is 8, you'd buy it. Third unit, price is 8, and your value's just 8, so you'd make the purchase. Good. Do you want a fourth unit? Listen to the words. Do you want a fourth unit? Yeah, and in fact, you'd buy it if the price was $7. But at a price of $8, your marginal value is less than price. So the quantity demanded would be 3 units. Only those where the marginal value is greater than or on the margin equal to price. If the price falls to $5, what are you willing to do? Anybody? What are you willing to do? Buy additional units, all the way out to where the marginal value is 5. You all with me? Same analysis, right? So the quantity demanded then would be 6 units at a price per unit of $5. Price falls to $2. The quantity demanded would be 9 units, the distance to the demand function at that particular per unit price. So demand is this data set. Demand is a whole set of data about different quantities at different per unit prices. Y'all with me? The word demand means the whole function. It is a schedule of the different quantities you're willing to buy at different per unit prices. It is not an amount. An amount would be the quantity demanded at the price of $5. You with me? Right? But demand is the whole thing. Demand's the whole relationship. And you read it horizontally because quantity is measured in a horizontal distance. If the price is 6, then you look at the graph, look at the distance, and you'd say at $6, I'm willing to buy 5 units. That's the quantity demanded when the price is $6. A change in price does not change demand. It changes what? The amount demanded. Good. The quantity demanded. A change in price is a movement along the schedule to a different quantity-price relationship. And so a change in price is not a shift of the function. It's just a change in the amount you're willing to buy at that lower or different per unit price. The first law of demand says it's a downward sloping function. It basically says the way it's normally quoted is the higher the price of the good, the smaller the quantity demanded. Look back at the demand curve. It's downward sloping, so at higher prices, the quantity is smaller. And at lower prices, the quantity is larger. So that is called the first law of demand. As the price declines, the quantity demanded increases. Or as the price rises, the quantity demanded decreases. Now, it's important to understand what we do mean by this and what we do not mean. And this is where people who don't understand economics get very confused. We draw it as a straight line function. But it looks like what I'm saying is that if the price of Heinz ketchup is $4 a bottle, you buy, 7 bottles per year. And it looks like what I'm saying is if the price goes up to $5.10, then you consume a smaller amount of Heinz ketchup. That's what it looks like the graph is trying to say. We're not saying that. We're not saying that. People who don't understand economics criticize it by saying it's too abstract, and they say the following. You guys assume that when people walk in the grocery store, they know every relative price of every item in the store, and they know instantaneously and costlessly that the price of Heinz ketchup has gone up by 10 cents. So you guys conclude then that night when you go to put ketchup on your fries, you put a little bit less ketchup on your fries. Well, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. Number one, you don't even know what the things are in the grocery store, right? You don't even know what's there, right? You know some of the stuff, but a lot of it I don't even know what it is, right? And secondly, you certainly don't know all the prices, and you don't notice every particular price change. So a better statement of the first law of demand is what I've put here. If the price goes up enough, you will buy less. Or if the price falls enough, you'd be willing to buy more. And here's my example. Gasoline prices fluctuate all the time, right? Gas prices, per gallon, right? It's $2.95, and then it's $3.10, and then it's $2.65, and then it's $3.25, and so forth. When you go in, if you see the price has gone from $2.80 to $3, do you buy less gas? No, you still fill up, right? In fact, most of the time you barely look at the price, right? Because you probably look at the dollar part of the price to say, okay, it's not above $5 yet. But that's all we're assuming is, we're not assuming that for every change in price you adjust your purchases. And we'll have some measures of that later on. But it does say this: if the price goes to $25 a gallon, I predict you will buy less gasoline. In fact, if the price goes to $100 a gallon, I predict Bill Gates will buy less gasoline. Everybody with me? What the first law of demand really says is, if price goes up enough, you will buy less. Or if price falls enough, you'd be willing to buy more. And that's the first law of demand. There are only 3 laws in all of economics, so it's a very simple science, 3 laws. But you need to know that is a major, major assumption. Demand is always downward sloping. Always downward sloping when we analyze it. As I pointed out, a change in price is a movement along that function, not a shift of the function. A change in price is taking me to a different point on the demand function. A change in demand would mean the entire function moves, because demand is that whole function or schedule of quantities. So an increased demand would mean larger quantities at each price. An increased demand would be a rightward shift of the function, indicating now that at each price the quantity demanded is larger. Everybody with me? Increase would be a rightward shift. Decrease would be a leftward shift, right? Smaller quantities at each price. We draw them parallel, but we're not assuming it's parallel. It's just for ease of demonstration. It could be tilted or it could do something. But it means at each price the quantity, in fact, has gone up. So now, when we're trying to build our model of all the things that affect what you buy, we want to think about other things that might change, which would lead you to buy larger amounts or smaller amounts. Other things about you or your life that would cause you to buy more at each price or buy less at each price. And these are called shift factors, because they are the factors which, when they change, would cause demand to move, would cause demand to increase or decrease. The first is called taste and preference. Taste and preference is describing how much you like the good. Just listen to the 2 words, taste. Do you like it a lot or not? And preference means, do I prefer, a Florsheim shoe to something else or whatever. So taste and preference represents the value you place on having various goods. Economists don't try and figure out where that comes from. We just say at any moment in time you have some set of preferences for all the things that you might in fact buy. It depends on, and psychologists investigate why it is the case. And it has to do with how you grew up, has to do with your physical abilities, right? What skills do I have? Has to do with your language. What language were you raised in? And that actually has an effect on taste and preference. The French language is a Romantic language, and in France, to say I love you is je t'aime. Je t'aime. Doesn't that sound great? Je t'aime. In German, it is ich liebe dich. Does that sound good?
No.
No, it sounds right, no. So all these things influence your taste and preference, and changes in your knowledge will change your taste and preference. Years ago, Katie Couric was on the Today Show, and they decided that the American people needed to know how much fat is in Mexican food. So they had a table laid out, and they had an enchilada and a tostado, and then tacos, and they had them all laid out. Behind each one was a plexiglass tube, 2 inches in diameter, and they had a gray gelatinous substance in there, which represented ounces of fat. And so they went across the table and they were saying, now, the enchilada has this many ounces of fat, and then the tostado has this many, and then the taco has this many, and so forth.
What's a tostado?
What?
A tostado?
I don't know what it is. It's a Mexican thing that has, stuff on it. Look it up on the web.
No, it's just Yeah, I've never heard that word, and I speak Spanish.
Good. Look it up. It is a word. Okay. Guys. Okay. So they thought the American people needed to know this. Now stop and think about it. If you saw that display and you went to work that day and it was lunchtime and one of your coworkers said, "Hey, how about Mexican food today?" What would you guess happened? People, no, I don't want Mexican food, because they had just seen all that information about how much fat was in Mexican food. So it changed their taste and preference. And believe me, it's true. For about a week, Mexican restaurants really suffered in reduced sales because people had been influenced by this horrible demonstration. You all knew there was fat in Mexican food. That's why it tastes so good, right? But we all knew that. But anyway, that's an example of changing information. They announced a study that says Diet Pepsi causes cancer in rats. Oh, gee, that's terrible, right? Well, it turns out that they fed the rats the equivalent of you're drinking 32 cans of Diet Pepsi per day for 21 years, and they got cancer. If you feed the rat anything in that intensity, it will get cancer. It will. No, I'm serious. If you give broccoli, and it'll cause cancer, right? But when you hear these things, it affects our changes in taste and preference to the extent we believe those things. Good. In the summertime, you buy more electricity because you want to have more air conditioning, because the ambient temperature is higher. In the wintertime, you buy less electricity, but you buy more heating oil or natural gas to heat the house. Those would be thought of as changes in taste and preference from the economist's point of view. More taste and preference, demand increases. Less taste and preference, demand decreases. Yeah.
Professor, is it possible actually to calculate that function or predict that function of demand?
Is it possible to do?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean it's done with regression analysis, but you can estimate it. Yeah. Yeah. Or you can do it with a survey, right? If the price is this, how many would you buy? And you can get estimates of it in that way. Good. And the sellers of major products know what that demand is. I mean, there are ways to analyze what it is, so they know pretty much what the demand is for their particular product, right? And whether it's gasoline at a Shell station or whether it's Nordstrom's bikinis, they have a pretty good estimate of what demand is. Yeah. From past sales, as a matter of fact, a major source of that information. Good. Okay, good. Second factor is clearly your income or wealth, because marginal value is the most you're willing and able to pay. So for normal goods, that's the usual case, for normal goods, as income goes up or your wealth increases, wealth is the value of all your assets, as income or wealth increase, demand for most goods tends to increase. You graduate from CSUN, you have an econ degree, so you get a job for $45,000, which is the highest starting salary of any of the majors in the business school. And now you buy more sushi and more wine and more prepared meals from Whole Foods and more Sculpin beer and more Bombay Sapphire gin. Good. That's normal goods. But to be complete, we know that in some cases, as your income goes up, you buy less of certain goods. So we define those as being called inferior goods. It doesn't mean low quality. It simply means within economics, as income rises, you buy less of that product. There's a product many of you are familiar with called Hamburger Helper. Hamburger Helper. Well, see, you know what it is, right? It's basically powdered fat in a box. And you mix it with hamburger, and there's a tomato version, and there's a white sauce Alfredo version, and it makes it taste better. Good. So you're now a starving student, and maybe you buy it 3 times a month, right? So the quantity demanded at this current level of income is 3 boxes per month. You graduate, your income goes up to $40,000. What happens to your demand for Hamburger Helper? It goes down, right? It's an inferior good. As income goes up, you'd say, no, I'm not buying that anymore. I'm going to buy prepared meals from Whole Foods and other kinds of things. Good. So that's an example of an inferior good. Income goes up, you tend to buy less of it. Yeah. Excellent. Very good. It means at every price, the quantity you're willing to buy and able to buy is larger. Excellent. Good. Good. Starbucks coffee. What would you guess that would be, a normal good or an inferior good?
I would say normal.
It is normal. In fact, it's actually called a superior good, meaning that as your income goes up, the percentage change in the amount purchased is actually greater than the percentage change in income. Good. So if you were Starbucks and you knew that increases in income would lead to an increased demand for your product, where would you want to open new outlets?
Higher price
Where incomes are rising. Good. Internationally, in what country have incomes been rising rapidly? China, absolutely. Starbucks has about 500 outlets in China today. I just read this morning. And this year, they are planning on doubling the number of outputs, the number of outlets by 500. And they're either in production or they're in plans by the end of the year to have 500 more outlets, because they know that as those incomes go up, people are willing to buy more of their product. When I first heard that Starbucks had moved to China, I thought, that is so stupid, right? The Chinese don't drink coffee. What do they drink? They drink tea, right? Let me tell you this. No matter how smart you are in your armchair philosophizing, if a major corporation does it, it's probably not stupid, right? It turns out that there's been a big increase in taste and preference for coffee or many things that are Western in China. And so the rising incomes has led to a big increase in demand, and that's why they're opening up larger number of outlets. It also turns out in China that it's not like the American model where you go in and tell them your name and then you stand around and they give you the cup and then you walk out. The outlet in Shanghai is 30,000 square feet. The new one is 30,000 square feet, a gigantic restaurant. And there's a maitre d', and you are seated at a table. You're given a menu. The waiter or waitress comes over and takes your order. They deliver the coffee to you. And so it's a very relaxing experience. And also, the young people tend to stay around and use their computers or go online and stuff. So it's a nice, quiet place. Okay, good. So Starbucks is a superior good or a normal good. When incomes declined dramatically in Detroit, particularly following the downturn of 2008, all these people left the city, and their incomes fell dramatically, and Starbucks closed a whole bunch of operations. But let me ask you this. If your income goes down, do you drink less coffee? No. Probably not. You drink less Starbucks, but you drink more of what? Folgers coffee, right? Maxwell House. Arco Gourmet Coffee. Arco is a gas station, but they sell, quote, Arco Gourmet Coffee. Good. Those are inferior goods. Those are inferior goods. So as income falls, you buy less of the normal good, more of the inferior good. Good. Third factor, if I'm going to spend money on one product, what I'm giving up is what I could have bought with that money, what I could have bought in terms of other products. So the price of other goods will influence what I'm willing to buy of a particular good. Now, most other goods are considered alternatives or substitutes. They're alternative ways of gaining personal satisfaction. When the price of a substitute falls, meaning you can buy more of that now at a lower price, that tends to decrease the demand for my product, because now you have a better alternative somewhere else. The quantity demanded increases of the other good. Your demand decreases as a result of that. Everybody with me? The easiest way to think about it is think of two really close substitutes, Domino's Pizza and Little Caesars, or Papa John's, or all these other pizza companies. If Little Caesars lowers their price, what will happen to the amount they sell? Increase quantity demanded. Everybody with me? Because that's a change in price, a movement along that curve. But as that becomes cheaper, the demand for Domino's will decrease, because now I've got a better, cheaper alternative over there. So a fall in the price of a substitute, which is a negative change, will lead to a reduction in my demand, which is a negative change, which means it is a positive relationship. Y'all with me? It means they move in the same direction. A fall in the price of the substitute lowers my demand. A rise in the price of the substitute increases my demand as the alternative has become more expensive. Yeah.
I've never noticed, but do franchise places typically keep their prices consistent? Like I haven't seen most franchise places switch their prices.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's usually,
Pretty stable.
yeah, it's relatively stable. But all we're saying now is the principle of defining when prices change and the other good is a substitute, what will happen. Now, and it's an interesting point that you brought up. Very close substitutes may have a big effect on that. But other goods may not be that close a substitute. And so the amount of the magnitude of the change differs depending on how similar the good is, right? Good. So those are substitutes. Yeah. This is your last one tonight.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. You can spend it now or later. No, it's fine. No, it's fine. You can spend it now or save it for later. All right, good. Then the other category of goods are called complementary goods. Complementary goods. And it means they're used together in an activity. They're used together in an activity. Think of playing tennis. Tennis balls, tennis rackets, tennis courts, tennis shoes, tennis shorts, rosin for your glove, a tennis towel, a tennis hat, a bag to carry all your tennis stuff to the court, and so forth. Those are all complementary goods. Everybody with me? They complement each other. They're all used together for a particular activity. As the price of tennis balls goes to $50 a can, what would happen to the demand for tennis rackets? It would go down, right? Because tennis is more expensive, you play less often, rackets last longer, and in that way. DVD players and DVDs, complementary goods, right? If DVD players become cheaper, people would buy more DVDs. If you go into Bed Bath & Beyond, and you go in that area where they have all the kitchen stuff, a lot of that is complementary goods, right? Because you have the coffee pot, and then you have the toaster oven, and then you have all these different appliances, right? And then within each one, you may have substitutes. You may have a Delanger and a Samsung and other ones like that. The same thing is true for sports equipment. Often there's all these different things that Wilson makes that are all complements. The bat and the ball and the glove and all of those would be complementary goods. Fourth factor, I think it's the fourth, or whatever. Another factor would be changes in your expectation about future prices. Changes in what you think the price of the good is going to be in the future time period. If you think a good is going to become more expensive later, what would you now tend to do? Buy more today. Good. So a rise in the expected future price would lead to an increased demand today. A rise in your expectation of the future price would tend to increase demand today. If you think it's going to become cheaper, then you might put off buying until the lower price comes along. So what kind of relationship is it? If future price goes up, demand today goes up. If future price goes down, demand today goes down. Positive relationship, right? They move in the same direction. Higher expected price in the future raises demand today. The category of goods for which this is most significant is financial assets, such as stocks and bonds and things of that nature. Today's price is determined by the demand to own the stock today, but it's primarily driven by expectations of future price. So when a company comes out and their earnings this quarter are higher than were expected, that means that you anticipate a higher price in the future, which means demand goes up today. Are you all with me? Right? If you think the price, if you think the good's going to become more valuable, then you buy more of it today. Finally, the market demand, the demand facing the seller, is the sum of all the demands of the existing buyers. You'd add those curves together horizontally. So market demand would be the summation of the quantity Ms. A is willing to buy at each price, and then at that same price, the amount B would buy, and then you'd get the quantity demanded in the marketplace. And you'd be adding those curves horizontally to get the total market demand over here. So more buyers would mean an increase in demand, and fewer buyers would mean a decrease in demand. It's that straightforward. In 1958, a guy discovered how to do fracking, which was the extraction of oil and natural gas from rock formations deep underground. And he figured out how to do it, but it was very expensive to do, and it wasn't done very much. And it was probably now, I guess, about 5 or 6 years ago, there were some real technological breakthroughs in how to do fracking. And the cost came way down. The ability to extract oil and natural gas by pumping water with certain additives down in to break and frack the rocks and thereby release the oil or natural gas became really much less expensive. There are still big shale formations in North Dakota and South Dakota. And so suddenly all these workers who were blue-collar workers were offered a lot of money to come up and do the fracking, right? And you have to run the rig. It's just like manufacturing. You know, it's a physical type of activity. So all of a sudden, in these cities, all these people moved in, and the price of housing went through the roof. Because now there's this big increase in the buyers who are willing and able to buy the houses. Y'all with me? And so it bid up the price of the houses and the groceries and the dry cleaning and all of the things in that particular area. So a rise in the number of buyers increases demand, and that's a rightward shift. A decline in buyers, for example, all the people who left Detroit led to declines in demand for everything, groceries and dry cleaning and all those kinds of things. Good. That's how simple the market model is. Now, some of you study engineering or architecture, and engineers have to know like 30 determinants, and they have to know like the volume, you know, how strong is the determinant, and they have to know all this stuff. Economics is simple. 5 determinants of demand: taste and preference, income or wealth, 2 possible directions, right? Normal and inferior. Price of other goods, 2 possible directions, substitutes, complements. Price expectations, number of buyers. That incorporates the entire model of demand. That incorporates all the factors that would affect how much people buy. The price effect is shown by a graph. The price effect is what you draw when you draw the demand curve. The other factors would cause that demand to increase or decrease in the ways that we have indicated. So you have to own these terms. You have to own these terms because this is one of the basic, it is one of the basic concepts and principles in the entire field of economics, is demand and demand management. And going back to what you were asking me about estimating them before, business firms, as I said, invest a lot of money hiring economists somewhat to try and estimate these and to estimate when income goes up, how much does demand increase, right? The magnitude of the effect as well as the direction. We know the direction by definition. If your income goes up and you buy more, it's what kind of a good? Income goes up, you buy more, it's called a normal good. And then the opposite is the inferior good. On 9/11 in 2001, the Twin Towers came down and then the Pentagon was hit, and we grounded all aircraft for 4 days because we didn't know how many more flying bombs there were flying around there. And then we reopened flying 4 days later on Monday. It hit on a Tuesday. We opened it back on Monday. But now there was a real issue about safety of flying. And so very quickly they put in these, they didn't have the whole TSA thing, but they put in restrictions on looking at you carefully when you got on the plane and identifying you more clearly and so forth. Good. So what used to take like a half an hour to get through the airport and get to the gate was now taking 2 hours, and then 3 and 4 hours, right? Because initially it took a long time to figure this out. Good. So knowing that, what happened to the, quote, cost of flying? Oh, it's great. What happened to the economic cost of flying? It went up substantially because now not only did you have to pay for the ticket, but you had to use 4 hours of your time. Good. So knowing that price, that economic cost went up, what are the substitutes for flying? Driving, good.
Road trip.
What?
Trains.
Trains, good. Buses, right. Skateboards, bicycles. No, they're substitutes. They're not very good, but they're substitutes. Good, right. What is the closest substitute for commercial flying? Private flying, good. So recognizing that the cost of commercial flying had gone up, we predicted that there would be a big increase in demand for private aircraft. And Chris Kraft had just come, and Learjet had just come out with a small four-seater that was like $1 million or something like that. Their sales went through the roof for these big companies and stuff. And so it's an application of exactly what we're talking about here. This price changes dramatically. The economist immediately says, okay, where is demand going to increase? Private flying. So we invested in aircraft manufacturing. But what also happened was a whole new industry arose, and that was selling hours of private flight time. Lots of companies have planes that they don't use all the time, right? You have it there, and when you need it, it's there. Well, these companies started to rent the plane out by hour of service and by geographic location. And companies had 12-seaters and 16-seaters and 6-seaters and 4-seaters. But this whole new market arose of renting out hours of flight time. And it was tremendously successful because people who could afford it, people who had, or people for whom getting there was very important, such as the executives of major corporations, would buy 10 hours of flight time. And it was on a use it or lose it basis because you reserved 10 hours of this aircraft for this month. So you have to pay for it because I'm renting it to somebody else. But it was a tremendous increase in demand because that's the closest substitute that's available. So all of what we're doing now is just using our knowledge of economics, and so far I've only done the shift factors for the determinants of demand, to understand how all these things are interrelated in the marketplace, how a change in one thing will have effects on other things. And if you can understand the economics and predict one step ahead of the obvious, then that's a way to make money, right? That's a way to understand what is probably going to happen and then invest one step ahead. And that's what speculators do, is hire